Uh, so I'm joined here by William Kofmehl, who, well, since we're talking about Pittsburgh, can I just ask you about the internationals that you remember? I mean, did you go to the ones as a kid? Any of these?
Sure, absolutely. The international acted as a means to see a number of works. Particularly, I recall a wonderful work by William Wegman, which, in the case of Wegman, it was kind of the dog calendar work. This was works of his early 20s that explored the black and white video scenarios in which he would establish a short little vignette. And there was a huge amount of influence within my own work from the viewership of those when I was probably at the age of 13. So,
and you're still in Pittsburgh. You're born and raised there?
I am. I was born north of the city,
Yep.
and currently I live in the city proper, and purchased a former synagogue, a 12,000 square foot space. So the wonderful thing about Pittsburgh is that it avoided, like much of the country, the collapse of the housing industry. And so it's an anomaly in the sense that you can build wealth quickly, and you can also empower yourself through property ownership. It's argued that gentrification is not necessarily happening there, much like it would have happened in London and New York and so forth. Just the way in which the city is laid out and the slow incline of that sprawl. So for me, I look at property historically as something that has been empowering to various cultures. Next to literacy, it's probably the second most empowering means of. So purchased a synagogue, moved in, set up a foundry within the basement, kind of penthouse suite in the third floor. The existing rabbi study is a guest quarters, and it was an Orthodox congregation, so it had the women were separated on the mezzanine, which is going to be taken over as additional artist studios for painters.
Nice. How would you characterize the Pittsburgh art scene now, and then also, what's its evolution been across your lifetime?
It's flourishing, and thanks to a number of individuals, one who had just spoken before me, it's rooted in a real interest in the local. And the Carnegie, for instance, have done remarkable things in terms of actually thinking about real inclusivity, which is obviously a buzzword that's floating around out there, but there are actually outfits within a number of the neighboring areas of Pittsburgh that have been established as forms of commune and forms of conversation that allow for a growth within the city that otherwise was not present. It's been fantastic in that regard.
Yeah, I mean, my own experience was just after school moving to New York, and then also being in Berlin, which are now that I live in Turkey, which is also a very small and very local art scene in comparison to those other places. I really appreciate what it means to have an artistic community, like a group of people who are just artists who, there is an art infrastructure, but it's different than when you live in a city that has a real industry and where people are there to make their careers as opposed to just live as artists.
Sure, there's a real authenticity throughout that city. Obviously, you have a number of schools that spring up throughout, and you have individuals that are committed to a particular lifestyle. I mean, if you look within the New York Times a few years ago, there was often the idea, get a life somewhere else, and this was suggested that Pittsburgh was one of those places, as well as Portland, but clearly Pittsburgh is far superior. We have a lot of old money. We have incredible cultural institutions, real estate, a great medical industry. So,
in your own work, your family has always played an important role. Maybe it's just anecdotal, but if I can ask you about the infamous building project from 2002 and 1, your senior year.
Oh, sure.
I mean, at least in that one, what I know is that your mother made you a lobster costume, and which you wore while you were building a temporary structure on the backside of one of Carnegie Mellon's buildings, which got you into a little bit of Well, it didn't get you into trouble, but it attracted trouble. And I was struck by, I was reading an old newspaper story about they were frat boys.
Delta Epsilon, yes.
Delta Epsilon fellows, as they were referred in the newspaper, who, did they vandalize your work? What was that story?
They did. Well, the idea was to build a 3-story platform-framed structure that I would live and dwell in while maintaining a vow of silence. I had contact microphones on my chest and throat, so I was monitoring my nighttime utterances. And at the time, I was also tethered by a 100-foot macrame cord that my mother had made. And so I had a Mr. John portable toilet that I had been renting with my own money, and I was using that, and I was also eating quite a bit of rice. I was in the best shape of my life because I was basically pickaxing. I was building footers for the house construction, and I was working from 9 until 3 in the morning. So it was a grueling process, but it was extremely. It was one that grew into a larger process of duration work in which I would take on a particular persona, and this being this particular character that maintained a vow of silence and that appeared within a larger feature-length film. And the house was actually functioning as a film set, so 20 minutes of the feature-length film was taking part within this structure. And so I had moved in within the winter months, and I tapped into the university's electric, and so I was basically living and dwelling there. And at one moment in 2:30 in the morning, around February 14th, I believe, there were a number of students that found it to be of interest to pay me a visit. I was a bit frightened because at the time I had a degree of sensory deprivation. Mind you, I hadn't spoken with anyone for a while, and I was intimately familiar with the inside of the structure, the sounds that I would be making. And so it sounded like a stampede. And I immediately triggered my alarm system to scare these individuals. And they were relentless. They had removed a 250-pound cast bronze sculpture, which would have been kind of the trophy for them, I would assume, that they would take back to the frat house. But there was quite a bit of damage. There were roof rafters being thrown off of the 3-story structure. At one point, I realized that the project was certainly compromised, and I thought at this point it would be wise to catch one of these individuals. So I, in a very ceremonious way, snipped the cord, which was functioning as kind of the umbilical cord. Mm-hmm. At the time, my sister was in a particular trimester, and so I likened the house to that of the womb. Snipped the cord and then jumped off the second story of the house. The adrenaline was kicking. And I ran down in my long johns down Forbes Avenue, which is a main artery through the city of Pittsburgh, and tried to catch up with 2 of these individuals. Succeeded, and it was quite a horrifying experience because it was somewhat out of body. I approached the 2 of them. One was clearly larger than the other. And so the idea is you go after the small one, but you put so much fear into that individual that the larger one takes note and stands back. But mind you, I'm in great shape, and it was quite remarkable. It was similar to that of the episode that you hear about the grandmother that watches the young little grandson fall underneath of a car, and she needs to perform some sort of rescue. So miraculously, she has the strength to lift up the end of the vehicle. Well, in a very similar fashion, somehow I managed to put the grip around the neck of this individual and lift him up off of his feet. And mind you, I had not spoken for quite some time, and all of this profane emission of spoken word came out, and I was watching this unfold from above, in a way. And if it wasn't for the fact that this young gentleman somehow knew my first name and squealed, "Bill!" I then lowered him down and just politely grabbed his wallet from the back of his pants and walked to my house, basically. At which time I realized that there were a number of squad cars. Remarkably, the police had taken note of this incident, and they were already on the scene. And I provided them with the wallet, and it actually went to a number of court proceedings. And the individuals had to pay me over $3,000 in restitution. They had to write a 15-page paper on diversity. had to enroll in an art class. So,
and now they're your students or protégés?
Absolutely.
Or maybe they were your first protégés. Your recent piece, I wanted to ask you the story behind Dear Father Knickerbocker. I just Googled you. And where that sort of... I mean, your work has... well, let me say that you build structures. There are durational performances, which are often very theatrical in the sense of being rooted in some sort of text. I think sometimes of your devising, but then also sometimes... I mean, I remember a Melville-inspired piece from university. But maybe you could tell us about Father Knickerbocker and this character.
Yeah, there's this wonderful gentleman by the name of Bernie Goetz, who's the notorious subway vigilante from 1984 that I happen to be very close friends with. And I was less interested in that particular polarizing event that was highlighted in a number of texts, specifically Tipping Point by Malcolm Gladwell, that kind of pseudo-intellectual work that so many people take delight in. Also, Goetz premiered on a show called Aftermath with William Shatner, which was quite interesting. Less interested in that 1984 event, more interested in the fact that soon after the shooting, Bernie started to live and dwell among squirrels. So he became what some would call a squirrel husbandrist. He would find squirrels that had fallen from a nest, and he would take them into his apartment, nurture them, inject them with calcium, and live and dwell. If he would exit New York City, what he would often do is, rather than ask a friend to watch over the squirrels, he would take them to Union Square and just release them. 3 days later, he would arrive on the scene, and he would just call out for them. And he typically would trim the tails so that he could take notice rather quickly as to which squirrel was his. So I was both interested with that particular event within the context of a larger historical New York past, which I was doing a lot of late-night Googling, obsessive Googling of the various boroughs of New York, making many drawings based on that Googling episode. And then many of those works were then being transformed into embroideries.
By yourself, or...?
I work with a fair trade outfit out of both Costa Rica and Nicaragua. And so I liken many of the embroideries to that of the process of the rendering with the mouse and the digital manipulation through means of Photoshop, and that of the kind of skin of the canvas, the linen, with the rayon thread and the kind of quilting circle dynamic that springs up in Monteverde, where you have women forming a circle and actually making each stitch that is very similar to each pixel that is depicted within these drawings that I then send down electronically, and then also pay them particular visits and make sure that there's some degree of quality control.
Yep. And that project also included like a very large steel cutout of a squirrel, which had a kind of flatness.
Yeah, the Trojan squirrel. Basically, opening night, there were a number of folks that inhabited the squirrel. My father, myself, another gentleman, Jacob, and Sam Sig. We were talking through the eyes of the squirrel and cooking corn and zucchini within the tail. And corn-fed squirrels are actually the most friendly.
I thought you were going to say delicious. Or I was worried you were going to say delicious. I'm glad you didn't. But what, your parents, as I recall, or maybe just your father, have participated in performances in the past. I don't know. Can you just tell me about your relationship, artistically, to involving your family? And because I don't know that many other artists who continually work with members of their own family.
Sure. The idea of the familial, it fits within a larger schematic that I like to think about, this kind of mathematical schematic box and whisker plot where you establish the mode, median, and mean, and outliers. So for me, if I were to use that as a way of suggesting my overall practice in relation to that schematic, I would look at the familial as falling within the mean, and then there's kind of faith and facility. That faith is tied to a process, which I could talk about later. And then the outliers are this idea of vicarious suffering and the economy of grace. And so the practice of making work and thinking about viewership, for me, deals with this notion of reciprocity. It deals with this idea of self-deprecation and empowering the viewer in a particular way. But through that empowerment, you're actually very controlling. I mean, you see the situation for what it is. Basically, you set something into motion through self-deprecation. You're allowing the viewer to transition from voyeur to participant, basically, and that plays into a number of works in which I will simply throw myself out into space and extend my arms and legs and try to achieve what would be maybe perfect parallel to the Earth.
Have you achieved that?
I have not, and I don't believe it's possible, actually. So.
And can you go back to the idea of process? Because your works feature both very sculptural elements and then this duration, but you make things really well. Or that's what I was always impressed by your.
Thanks, H.E.
You're one of the most impressive builders of objects that I certainly remember. And then you cast your own works.
I do. I'm very. I had mentioned that the embroidery works are part of a fair trade operation where it's out of my hand, my physical hand for the making. However, with bronze casting, which is obviously a very laborious process, but it's tied to a larger historical reference, and I'm fascinated, for one, with the idea of bronze and metallurgy and where it has come. You think historically it was originally used for weapons of war, and then you start to chart its path through the 15th century with the Gutenberg press, and you started to have a certain type of alloy that was composed for typeset. And so the proliferation of the written word, and therefore literacy, all of a sudden is suggesting that, wow, this same kind of material, this particular change of alloy, can all of a sudden be a uplifting, empowering medium, which we've obviously seen within the last year overseas with the spread of a particular literature and texts that have become a means or a voice.
And finally, I should wrap it up, but I don't know how much, or just general thoughts about being in Hong Kong. You mentioned that you'd like to spend some time here, but do you see it influencing your work, living abroad?
No.
With that interest?
Absolutely not.
So you remain Pittsburgh. I mean, a person. I mean, I don't want to pigeonhole your practice at all, but
pigeon is something that I had yesterday, which was quite good, actually.
It was good?
It was very good, yeah. Breakfast. Right.
With congee?
No.
It's a blander breakfast. But I actually look forward to coming to visit. I hope when I'm in Pittsburgh to see Dan's show and, getting to see this studio and home that you're creating, and also just to see more of your practice.
Yeah, we'll be having an art fair in 2020.
Are you directing?
No, Dan over there, actually.
Great. Well, we look forward to that. Thank you, Bill, for talking with us here in Hong Kong. Bill Kofmehl.